Hi, I'm Dr. Kaminske from the Learning Scientists, and in this office hours video, I want to talk about how to use the learning strategies when planning for some different kinds of course formats. So typically when we talk about how to use the learning strategies effectively in teaching and learning, we're usually referring to courses that are taking place over a semester, let's say, where you're meeting every day, maybe every other day, over several weeks, months, and you really have a lot of time to dig into the material, call back to it, and do all these different effective learning strategies. But that's not always possible. Sometimes you're being asked to present information or learn information in a kind of one-off workshop or a series of workshops, or maybe you're taking or teaching an accelerated course. That's what I'm doing this semester. I'm teaching an accelerated course in intro psychology, which I've taught dozens of times at this point, but I've always taught it over the course of a regular semester. So I realized when I was sitting down to kind of plan out and structure the learning that would be happening in this course, I had to approach it a little bit differently than I would in a regular course. So I wanted to talk about how I'm applying the learning strategies a little bit differently in this course than I have in other courses, and how I kind of think about those learning strategies when I'm applying them in a workshop setting, as well as offer some guidance for anyone who's had to take courses that are in this accelerated format, or if you've been attending workshops and you want to know how you can get the most out of those workshops. I wanted to touch on those things. So before I get started, I want to say that I'm mainly going to be focusing on retrieval practice, spacing, and interleaving. Dual coding, concrete examples, elaboration are still incredibly important and are definitely things that I use in my everyday teaching and things that we always try to implement in our workshops. It's just that our use of them doesn't really change as much, I don't think, as a result of this different format. However, when I'm thinking about the course, what does seem to change is how I approach retrieval practice, how I approach spacing, and how I approach interleaving. So one of the big challenges here is that we know that we get better learning. People are more likely to remember the information for longer. They're more likely to have a better understanding of the information when we can practice retrieval that's spaced out over time. So obviously classes that happen over a more long semester format tend to have better outcomes because students are being asked to retrieve information more consistently and over a longer period of time. Generally, workshops as a learning tool are not super effective for long-term retention if you never return back to that material. So it's not that they are completely ineffective and not worth going to. They're most definitely worth going to, but it depends on how you approach your learning in that workshop and how you approach your teaching within that workshop as well. So one of the big challenges to overcome when teaching these classes in a sort of like condensed format is you don't have as much time to play with. And this is kind of a bit of a paradox because at the same time you have too much time. So when I'm planning out my lessons for a 2-hour class versus a 1-hour class, I have to approach that in a very different way. Most of the classes I'm used to teaching are 1 hour, so I know how to structure a lesson in a sort of 1-hour plan. 2 hours gets a little bit more unwieldy. When I've had to plan workshops that are 4 hours or maybe all day, that is a significant amount of time because you can't necessarily pack in 4-hour lessons into one 4-hour chunk. In part because you don't have the spacing that you need in order to kind of lay the groundwork for concepts and build on those concepts and really sort of build on basic understanding. It can be too much. I usually end up cutting information when I go from 4 separate hour lessons to one big 4-hour chunk. On the other hand, in the longer format, it does give you more time to explain things in better detail, to provide more examples, activities, right? So there are kind of pros and cons. At least when I approach it, that's how I approach it. So when I've approached these classes, again, I'm teaching a 2-hour class that meets Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So it's a bit grueling for the students and for me. What I've done to break it up for me and for them is I've approached it as having two-hour lessons, more or less, where at the beginning of the lesson, at the very beginning of the day, I say, hey, here are the 5 questions we're going to go over. Because I know that it's difficult for anyone really to sustain their attention for 2 straight hours. I also provide a break about halfway through. So we have lesson one, we take a quiz, we go on break so that they can get up, get a drink of water, move around a bit. And so that usually I can have a seat and kind of collect my thoughts and prepare for the next set of lecture notes. And then we go on for the next hour. And when I arrange workshops, I do a similar thing where I try to put in sort of strategic breaks, not just for attention or for letting people get up and stretch and move around, but also to help break up the learning and to provide some more opportunities for retrieval practice and some spacing within the lesson. So again, the big difference between teaching over a regular semester versus teaching in an accelerated course or in a workshop is the time. You don't have as much, you don't have as much time to play with. So by structuring it into smaller chunks, that means that I'm introducing spacing within the lesson. So when I'm asking students to take a quiz or retrieve, usually it can be as simple as when they come back, I'll say, hey, so in the first half, we talked about the following concepts. Can anyone give me a definition of those concepts? Or can someone give me an example that we've talked about? Or maybe I can use that as a springboard into the next set of lecture notes and say, so in that first half, we talked about, so the last lecture I gave was on psychological disorders and how we classify them. So after the first half, I said, could anyone tell me what were the 4 different ways we said we could classify disorders? Okay, now that we've talked about classifying and how we actually label something as a disorder, what do you think the effects are of labeling somebody with a disorder? Which we've said kind of by definition meets all these criteria. What are the implications of that? Right, so I give them an opportunity to sort of retrieve their knowledge and hopefully elaborate a little bit more before going on. But I was able to do that because I had structured it so that we had these 2 separate kind of chunks within the lecture. So it's not as, I would say it's not as effective as when you can spread that out over several days. Whereas normally in a class that's going at this rate, I would be able to say, so yesterday or last time we talked about these concepts, and then forcing them to retrieve that information, bring it to mind, we're able to space it out. Right, and instead I'm saying, 20 minutes ago we talked about this thing, why don't we go ahead and bring it up again? It's still effective though, because when we think about how much time needs to elapse before we can effectively engage in meaningful retrieval processes, it's really not that much time. Most memory researchers classify short-term and long-term memory as the difference between something that happened a few minutes ago and something that happened more than a few minutes ago. Clearly, it's more difficult to remember stuff over time. We know that it's hard to remember something that happened 5 minutes ago versus 2 minutes ago, or 5 years ago versus 2 years ago. So there is some sort of meaningful difference within those stretches of time. But in general, when we're looking at whether or not you're going to engage in retrieving something from long-term memory, you really only need 4 or 5 minutes for that to happen. So even if it's just every 20 minutes, it's kind of stopping and saying, hey, let's take a second to reflect back and recall what we just did, that can still be very beneficial. The other thing is that in these classes, I feel like there's both more and somehow less interleaving. Less in the case of how I've structured this particular course, because there's just not enough time to test over previously learned material. I do my best to try to make connections where possible and try to have them distinguish between similar topics. But also we're just flying through the information at such a fast pace, there's not that much time to do that. On the other hand, because I'm presenting more information closer together in time, they're kind of forced to interleave and to compare and contrast things. So normally in this course, when I am at this point in the material, when we're talking about psychological disorders and therapy, and I'm asking them to call back and remember ideas from neuroscience or from social psychology, in a normal semester, that information would have been presented months ago, 2, maybe 3 months ago at that point. in this class, that information was presented last week. And so I can ask them and say, hey, we're talking about self-fulfilling prophecy. We've used that term before. How is this different than the last time we used this term? When we're looking at these two approaches to psychology, right, how can we compare and contrast these two things to understand the differences and the similarities between them? So in a way, it's forcing some interleaving because we're teaching similar topics closer together in time, forcing them to switch back and forth. But at the same time, I kind of have less leeway and time to play with in order to create more opportunities for that. So my advice when planning out these longer sessions is to be mindful of, again, the lack of time for spacing and effective interleaving to happen, and to try to engineer more opportunities for that to happen within the lesson, and to understand that you can have spacing and interleaving within the lesson as well as between lessons, but that may be a slightly different approach than you've taken when you think of classes as separate lesson plans that are happening day to day. Instead, if I'm teaching a longer session or a workshop, I tend to view the workshop as having several lessons within that workshop, thus creating opportunities for spacing and interleaving and more retrieval practice. Now, if you're a student in those classes, learning from them can be challenging. And I'm very aware that for my students, I mean, it's kind of exhausting for me to go through and teach basically a chapter a day to get through the material. It has to be very overwhelming for them. So the other reason why I'm providing all of this good structured retrieval practice and spacing and calling back to things is to help give them some grounding and structure in what's happening instead of just throwing a bunch of information at them. And again, I also know that because we don't have as much spacing, the learning that they're getting is going to be at a different kind of quality, different level. So my advice to anybody in these classes is to try to go back and practice and review as much as you can. This is especially important with workshops, because I want to talk about that for a second. Because like I said before, workshops as just a one-off activity can be a really great introduction to some sort of professional development, or some new technology that you're using, right? There are lots of reasons why people will seek out workshops to want to learn more about something. And they can be really great when you're in them and you feel really energized and you're really excited because you've learned something new. You've maybe even met some people who have similar experiences and you've been able to talk about those, and they're really great to go to. Where they can kind of fall off sometimes is people assume that now they've done the work and they've learned it and they don't have to return back to the material. And that is not true. Again, because it's happening in one shot or maybe a collection of workshops, which would really be preferable, you don't get the opportunity to engage in that beneficial spacing of retrieval practice and hopefully interleaving to help you better understand the concepts. You don't really get as much of that as you do if you had taken maybe a longer course on the topic. So workshops can be really effective if you actually plan on engaging in whatever it is that you've learned frequently over the coming months or weeks. So if you've gone to a workshop to maybe learn a new piece of technology that's relevant for your job, then that workshop can be really beneficial for you because you're going to go and use that technology and use the information that you learned in the workshop, having to retrieve it, having to apply it relatively immediately and consistently over a period of time. However, if you go to a workshop and maybe you've learned about some neat technique that you think is really interesting and beneficial, but you won't be able to use it or apply it for the next few months or year, you're going to find that you won't remember very much from that workshop unless you've been given opportunities to re-engage with material, to practice retrieval, to space. So having follow-ups from workshops are really beneficial. Getting together with people to talk about what you've learned in that workshop can be really helpful, again, because you're just kind of spacing out your learning and reinforcing what you had learned in there and retrieving it. So I hope this is helpful to kind of think about the different ways in which we have to structure and plan and learn in slightly different settings, and that time can be a really big factor. Again, the key thing is that you need to provide more opportunities, either because you're the instructor and you're providing opportunities for retrieval practice and spacing, or as the learner, as somebody trying to get the most out of these workshops or accelerated courses, whatever it is, getting the most out of that you can. You have to be mindful that you do need to re-engage with that material over time in order to benefit with it.